I arrived at my son's engagement dinner in my finest clothes. But as I walked into the ballroom, the bride smirked, nudged her mother, and whispered loud enough for the whole room to hear, "Oh look, they even invited the handyman." I stood there frozen. I was about to turn around and walk out the door when my son grabbed my hand and said quietly, "Dad, trust me. Just tonight. It is time for us to get our revenge." 2 hours later, the bride started screaming. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who severely underestimated your worth. My name is William Gallagher. I am 70 years old. Since my wife Diane passed away a few years ago, my world has mostly been confined to the walls of my garage. It is a quiet, peaceful life. I spend my days doing woodwork, breathing in the scent of pine and mahogany, wearing faded flannel shirts and scuffed steel-toed work boots. To the outside world, I am just a retired old man puttering away his final years with a lathe and a sander. But the sawdust covering my clothes has always been a very convenient mask. My son Michael is my absolute pride and joy. He is 30 years old, hardworking and loyal to a fault. I raised him to respect everyone regardless of the dirt under their fingernails or the balance in their bank accounts. But that same loyalty became a heavy chain around his neck the day he met Vanessa. Vanessa was a hurricane wrapped in designer labels. She came from a family that tried extremely hard to project an image of old money. Her parents, Gerald and Pamela, were the kind of people who leased luxury cars they could barely afford and loudly dropped French culinary terms at restaurants just to make the waitstaff feel inferior. From the very first time Michael brought Vanessa to my house for a Sunday roast, the disdain in her eyes was unmistakable. She refused to sit on my living room sofa, claiming the fabric looked like a thrift store reject. She barely touched the meal I had spent hours cooking. Instead, she spent the entire evening complaining to Michael about my neighborhood speaking loud enough for me to hear from the kitchen. When her parents finally graced my home with their presence, a few weeks later the condescension escalated from subtle jabs to open mockery. Gerald walked into my home wearing a tailored suit that smelled of cheap cologne and desperation. Pamela followed closely behind, holding a scented handkerchief to her nose as if my modest 3-bedroom house were an active hazard zone. "Oh, William," Pamela sighed, waving her hand through the air. "How do you live with that constant stench of sawdust? It is absolutely suffocating. It clings to everything." I noticed Vanessa wrinkling her nose in agreement. I simply smiled politely and offered them a drink. I was the host and I would not lower myself to their level. But they treated my politeness as an open invitation to treat me like hired help. During dinner, Gerald snapped his fingers at me to refill his wineglass. When I handed him the bottle, he looked at my hands, his lip curling in utter disgust. "Good Lord," William Gerald scoffed. "Have you never heard of a manicure? Those calluses are practically prehistoric. A man your age should be relaxing, not scraping his knuckles to the bone like a common day laborer." I looked down at my hands. They were rough-scarred and permanently stained with varnish. They were the hands that had built a life for my son, the hands that had gently cared for my dying wife. To Gerald and Pamela, these hands were a pathetic sign of poverty. To me, they were a badge of honor. Vanessa chimed in with a cruel little laugh. "Honestly, Michael, you should buy your dad some gloves for Christmas. I am terrified he is going to snag my silk dress every time he walks past me." Michael tightened his grip on his fork. His knuckles turned stark white. He opened his mouth to defend me, but I caught his eye across the table and gave a microscopic shake of my head. "Let it go," my look said. "Do not ruin your evening for my pride." Michael swallowed his words, but the tension in his jaw was painful to watch. I endured the insults silently. I swallowed my pride with every condescending remark. Every eye roll, every command barked at me as if I were their personal butler. I did it for Michael. I loved my son too much to be the wedge that destroyed his relationship. But as the months dragged on toward the wedding, I noticed a profound and disturbing shift in my son. The bright, ambitious young man I had raised was slowly disappearing before my eyes. Michael looked perpetually exhausted. The dark circles under his eyes seemed to deepen with every passing week. His smiles were forced, and his laughter had lost all its warmth. He was suffocating under Vanessa's toxic demands. Every time she called, he would flinch. She demanded expensive dates, luxurious gifts, and constant validation. She was draining him not just financially, but emotionally. I could see the light leaving his eyes, replaced by a hollow, desperate compliance. I remember one particular afternoon when Michael came over to help me organize the garage. It used to be our favorite way to spend a Saturday, just the two of us drinking black coffee and fixing up old furniture. But that day, his phone rang incessantly. It was a customized ringtone that belonged only to Vanessa. Each ring made his shoulders tense up. He answered it on the fourth ring, and I could hear her shrill voice echoing from the speaker, berating him for picking the wrong shade of white for the wedding invitations. She was screaming about eggshell versus ivory, telling him he was utterly useless when it came to aesthetics. Michael just stood there staring blankly at a pile of lumber, repeating the words, "I am sorry, Vanessa. I will fix it. I will pay for the reprint." When he finally hung up, he looked like a man standing in front of a firing squad. I walked over and handed him a mug of coffee. "You look tired, son," I said softly. He gave a hollow, self-deprecating laugh. "I am fine, Dad. Just wedding stress. You know how it is." But I knew exactly how it was, and this was not normal wedding stress. This was the slow, systematic dismantling of a man's spirit. Vanessa and her fake wealthy family were treating my son the exact same way they treated me. We were just tools to be used until we were broken. I watched him rub his temples, the weight of their relentless expectations crushing him. I wanted to tell him the truth right then and there. I wanted to shake him and remind him of exactly who he was, but I knew that simply telling him would not be enough. He had to see it for himself. He had to see the absolute rot at the core of the family he was about to marry into. So I kept my silence. I went back to sanding my piece of mahogany, letting the sawdust cover my clothes and my secrets. I would continue to play the role of the pathetic blue-collar handyman. I would let Gerald and Pamela treat me like dirt. I would let Vanessa roll her eyes at my flannel shirts. I would endure the smoldering disrespect, building a quiet reservoir of patience. Because an old carpenter knows one fundamental truth about building things. Before you can tear down a rotten structure, you have to let the termites expose the full extent of their damage. And Vanessa's family was working overtime to expose theirs. The confrontation happened on a rainy Tuesday evening inside Michael's modest two-bedroom apartment. I had come over to fix a leaky faucet in their guest bathroom, bringing my toolbox and keeping to myself. I preferred it that way. It allowed me to blend into the background while Vanessa held court in the living room. She had invited her mother Pamela over to review the latest additions to her absurdly thick wedding planner binder. Michael was sitting on the edge of the sofa looking like a man awaiting a life sentence, while Vanessa paced the floor with a glossy brochure in her manicured hands. I was wiping my hands on a shop towel standing just inside the hallway where the kitchen met the living room. They knew I was there, but to Vanessa and Pamela, I was no more significant than a piece of furniture. That is when Vanessa dropped the brochure onto the coffee table with a theatrical sigh. She announced that she had finally found the absolute perfect venue for their engagement dinner. Not the wedding, mind you, just the engagement dinner. She pointed to the glossy pages and declared they were going to book the main ballroom at the Grand Monarch. Even I felt my chest tighten at the name. The Grand Monarch was the most elite, exclusive, unapologetically expensive hotel in the downtown financial district. It was a place where politicians and billionaires hosted galas, a place dripping in crystal chandeliers and imported Italian marble. Michael leaned forward, rubbing his tired eyes. He asked her, his voice barely above a whisper, how much a dinner like that was going to cost. Vanessa did not even blink. She crossed her arms, lifted her chin, and casually stated it would be a flat $150,000. She said it the way normal people talk about the price of a cup of coffee. $150,000 for a single meal, a few hours of drinking champagne, and showing off for her parents' country club friends. Michael physically recoiled. He looked at the brochure, then up at his fiancée, his face pale and stricken. He tried to inject some reason into the room. He reminded her gently that they had a strict budget. He talked about the savings account they were supposed to be using for a down payment on their first home. He explained that his salary simply could not cover a six-figure party, let alone the actual wedding that was still months away. Vanessa did not take rejection well. Her face contorted into a mask of pure indignation. She began to raise her voice, pacing the room with heavy, angry steps. She accused Michael of trying to humiliate her. She told him that her parents had an image to uphold, that all of Pamela and Gerald's friends were expecting an event that matched their social standing. Pamela sat on the sofa, sipping a glass of sparkling water, nodding in silent agreement, as her daughter berated the man she supposedly loved. Michael tried to reach for her hand to calm her down, but she snatched it away. She told him that if he really loved her, he would find a way to make it happen. He would not embarrass her by forcing her to host an engagement party at some mediocre country club or local restaurant. Then she made the pivot. The sheer audacity of her next words sent a cold shockwave down my spine. Vanessa stopped pacing, turned to Michael, and pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at the hallway where I was standing. She lowered her voice slightly, but not enough to hide her venom. She told Michael that the solution was staring him right in the face. She said it was entirely ridiculous that a single elderly man was living alone in a 3-bedroom property while they were struggling to fund their future. She demanded that Michael make me sell my house. I stood frozen, the shop towel gripped tightly in my fist. My house. The home where I had carried my late wife over the threshold. The home where we had painted the nursery yellow for Michael. The home filled with every precious memory I had left of my marriage. Vanessa called it a crummy, outdated shack. She said the property value in my neighborhood had peaked anyway, and that I was being selfish by hoarding an asset that could be liquidated to give them the cash they needed. She mapped out my entire future in less than 60 seconds. I was to sell the house, give them the bulk of the proceeds for the Grand Monarch dinner and the wedding, and use whatever pennies were left to move into a cheap rental apartment somewhere far away from their social circle. Pamela chimed in, then her voice dripping with that fake, sugary concern she always used when she was being her most vicious. She told Michael that it was the natural order of things. Parents are supposed to sacrifice for their children. She said it was only fair that I do my part to ensure Vanessa had the fairy tale life she deserved. Michael looked like he had been physically struck. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked from Vanessa to Pamela, completely overwhelmed by the sheer force of their entitlement. He weakly mumbled that he could not ask his father to give up his home. He tried to say that my house was all I had left, but Vanessa was just getting started. The true depth of her cruelty had not yet been reached. She stepped closer to Michael, her voice dripping with disgust. She told him that selling my house would solve 2 problems at once. Not only would it give them the money they desperately needed for the Grand Monarch, but it would also give them a convenient excuse to keep me away from the event entirely. My breath caught in my throat. I stood perfectly still in the shadows of the hallway, listening as the woman who was about to marry my son systematically erased my existence. Vanessa explicitly told Michael that I should not attend the engagement dinner under any circumstances. She said my presence would be a total disaster for her family's reputation. She waved her hand dismissively in my direction, complaining about my calloused hands, my faded flannel shirts, and what she called my pathetic blue-collar aesthetic. She told him that her parents had invited state senators and corporate executives. She said she could not bear the humiliation of having to introduce a dirty retired carpenter as her future father-in-law. She insisted that I would look utterly ridiculous standing in the marble foyer of the Grand Monarch, that I would probably embarrass her by using the wrong fork or spilling cheap beer on the tablecloths. Pamela nodded sympathetically, patting her daughter's arm. She told Michael that Vanessa was right. It was a matter of optics. She suggested they could just tell people I was too sickly to travel a convenient little lie to explain away the absence of the groom's father. They were discussing my banishment from my own son's life as casually as they might discuss changing the color of the floral arrangements. They were stripping away my dignity, my home, and my place in my family, all to serve their delusional vanity. I waited for the explosion. I waited for the moment Michael would stand up, throw them both out of his apartment, and defend the father who had sacrificed everything for him. I waited for him to tell Vanessa that if I was not welcome at the dinner, there would be no dinner and there would be no wedding. But the explosion never came. Michael did not argue. He did not yell. He simply sank deeper into the sofa, looking entirely broken. His shoulders slumped, and he stared down at the floor. The fight had been completely drained out of him by months of constant emotional manipulation. He was a hostage in his own relationship, conditioned to believe that any resistance would only result in more screaming, more punishment, and more pain. He took the abuse. He absorbed every cruel, venomous word they threw at him and at me. He sat there in total silence while Vanessa victoriously returned to flipping through her glossy hotel brochures, having successfully dictated the terms of my removal from their lives. I stepped out of the shadows and walked slowly into the living room. Vanessa and Pamela did not even look up. They continued discussing the menu options as if I were a ghost passing through. But Michael looked up. He slowly raised his head, and his tired, defeated eyes met mine across the room. It was a look that shattered my heart, but it also ignited a cold, dangerous fire deep within my chest. In that brief, silent exchange, no words were needed. His eyes were wide with shame, filled with a desperate, silent apology. He was begging for my forgiveness, acknowledging the horrible reality of what he was trapped in. It was a silent communication between father and son, a mutual understanding that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. He knew she was a monster. He knew they were destroying him, but he was too paralyzed by fear and exhaustion to fight back. I did not show any anger. I did not betray a single emotion. I just looked at my son, gave him a very slow, deliberate nod, and walked quietly out the front door. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully bullied a weak, foolish young man and his pathetic, penniless father. They thought they were going to take my home and banish me to the shadows. But as I walked down the apartment stairs and out into the cool night air, I was not feeling defeated. I was feeling something entirely different. I was feeling the precise, calculated focus of a man who knows exactly how to tear down a rotten structure. Vanessa wanted a $150,000 dinner at the Grand Monarch. She was going to get exactly what she asked for, and it was going to be the most expensive mistake she ever made in her entire life. I found myself on my knees on the cold tile floor of Vanessa's luxury apartment just 3 days later. The air in her guest bathroom smelled overwhelmingly of artificial lavender and expensive chemical cleaners. I was wedged under the dual vanity sink with a flashlight gripped in my teeth. The pipes were leaking. It was a simple fix for anyone with a bit of sense, but Vanessa had absolutely refused to hire a professional plumber. She had called Michael in a panic that morning, demanding it be fixed immediately. Naturally, she suggested that since I had nothing better to do with my pathetic retirement, I should be the one to do the manual labor. It saved her a few $100s. That was money she would likely spend on another pair of designer shoes. I agreed to do it. Not for her, but because it kept the peace for my son. I wore my usual work clothes, a faded blue flannel and denim jeans stained with wood glue. I worked in total silence. I tightened the plastic joints and wiped away the excess grime. The apartment was completely quiet when I arrived. Michael was still at the office and Vanessa was supposed to be out at a bridal fitting. I thought I had the place to myself. That was until I heard the heavy front door swing open and click shut. I reached up to turn off the water valve when the sharp clicking of high heels echoed down the hardwood hallway. 2 distinct sets of footsteps approached the kitchen, which shared a thin adjoining wall with the bathroom. I recognized the voices immediately. It was Vanessa and her mother, Pamela. I stayed perfectly still under the sink. I had no desire to deal with their condescension, so I figured I would just wait for them to move to the living room before packing up my tools and leaving quietly. I heard the unmistakable sound of a wine bottle popping open and crystal glasses clinking together. They were celebrating something. I was about to slide out from under the vanity and announce my presence when Vanessa spoke. Her voice was loud and entirely stripped of the fake sugary sweetness she used around Michael. She laughed a sharp, mocking sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. She told her mother that Michael had been incredibly easy to handle the night before. She called him a spineless pushover. She boasted about how he did not even try to fight back when she demanded the engagement dinner at the luxury hotel. My chest tightened. I stopped breathing. I stayed wedged under the sink, gripping my heavy steel wrench as Pamela let out a low, amused chuckle. Pamela told her daughter that she had trained him well. She praised Vanessa for breaking Michael down so efficiently. She said that a husband with no backbone is the easiest kind to manage. They were talking about my son as if he were an animal they had successfully domesticated. The sheer malice in their casual afternoon conversation was staggering. But the mockery was only the beginning. Pamela poured more wine and lowered her voice to a conspiratorial tone, though the thin walls offered no real privacy. She told Vanessa that they needed to stay focused on the ultimate goal. Pamela warned her daughter not to push Michael so hard that he breaks off the engagement before the papers are signed. The wedding certificate, Pamela said, was the key to everything. Once they were legally married, Michael and his assets would become marital property. Vanessa laughed again and agreed. She said she could easily endure another few months of pretending to care about his boring job and his pathetic feelings. Then Pamela shifted the conversation to a topic that froze the blood in my veins. She brought up my name. Pamela told Vanessa that Gerald and his business were on the absolute brink of total collapse. She revealed that they were completely out of cash and drowning in hidden lawsuits. The luxury cars, the country club memberships, the designer clothes, all of it was a fragile house of cards ready to crumble. Pamela explicitly stated that my property was the only lifeline they had left. She laid out the timeline with cold, calculated precision. She told Vanessa that right after the honeymoon, they needed to execute the final phase. They were going to leverage Michael to take out massive loans against his own savings, funneling the cash directly into Gerald and his failing company under the guise of family investments. But that would not be enough. Pamela told her daughter that my house was the real prize. The property value was skyrocketing. Pamela instructed Vanessa to start documenting my behavior to twist my quiet nature into signs of severe mental decline. They planned to hire a corrupt doctor they knew from the country club to declare me legally incompetent. Vanessa sounded thrilled by the idea. She cheerfully asked her mother how long the process would take. Pamela replied that it would be swift. Once I was declared unfit, they would force Michael to sign over his power of attorney. They would seize my home, liquidate the property, and throw me into the cheapest state-run nursing facility they could find. Pamela literally referred to it as the gloomy cinder block building on 5th Street, a place notorious for neglect and misery. They planned to stick me in a shared room with a stranger and leave me there to rot, completely stripping me of my dignity, my home, and my savings. All of it to fund their fake, lavish lifestyle. The pure evil radiating from the kitchen was physically sickening. They were not just greedy, they were completely devoid of human empathy. They viewed my life and my son as nothing more than raw materials to be consumed and destroyed. The sheer horror of their premeditated plot overwhelmed me. A wave of nausea hit my stomach. My hands began to shake uncontrollably. I tried to shift my weight on the hard bathroom tile, trying to process the magnitude of the betrayal I was hearing. But as I moved, my sweaty palm slipped. The heavy steel wrench slid right through my fingers. It hit the porcelain base of the toilet and slammed onto the tile floor with a loud metallic crash that seemed to echo like a gunshot in the small bathroom. I completely froze. I squeezed my eyes shut, my heart hammering furiously against my ribs. I waited for the footsteps. I waited for Vanessa and Pamela to burst into the bathroom, furious and panicked that I had heard every single word of their criminal conspiracy. I held my breath, bracing for the inevitable confrontation. 10 seconds passed, then 20. The only sound coming from the kitchen was the clinking of wine glasses and another burst of cruel laughter. The television must have been playing in the background, or perhaps their own arrogance had simply made them deaf to the world around them. They had not heard the wrench fall. I slowly let out a trembling breath, thanking whatever higher power was watching over me. I reached down to pick up the wrench, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts on what to do next. I needed to warn Michael. I needed to find a way to tell my son that the woman he loved was actively plotting to destroy both of our lives. I slowly backed out from under the sink and stood up in the narrow bathroom hallway. I wiped the sweat from my forehead, gripping the tool tightly in my hand. But as I turned around to face the doorway, the breath was knocked completely out of my lungs. I was not alone in the hallway. Standing just 3 feet behind me, half hidden in the shadows of the corridor, was Michael. He was wearing his work suit, his briefcase dangling forgotten from his loose fingers. He had come home early. He had walked into the apartment silently, just moments after I did. He was standing close enough to the kitchen wall to hear every single word that had been spoken. I stared at my son. His face was entirely drained of color. His skin was a sickly pale white and his eyes were wide with a kind of agony I had never seen before. He was trembling, completely paralyzed by the crushing weight of the truth. He had heard the mockery. He had heard the plan to steal his savings. He had heard the horrific, calculated plot to lock his own father away in a miserable institution. The fake smile, the forced compromises, the endless financial demands, all the puzzle pieces snapped into place in his mind with brutal clarity. He looked at me, a single tear spilling over his lower lid and trailing down his cheek. No words were needed between us. The illusion was dead. I grabbed my son by the arm. My grip was tight and absolute. I pressed my finger to my lips, signaling for total silence. Michael was shaking so hard, he looked like he might collapse right there in the narrow hallway. We backed away slowly. We moved inch by inch toward the front door, making sure our footsteps made absolutely no sound on the hardwood floor. In the kitchen, Vanessa and Pamela were still laughing and clinking their wine glasses, completely unaware that their entire universe had just violently shifted. I turned the brass doorknob with agonizing slowness. I pulled Michael out into the corridor and eased the door shut until the latch clicked softly into place. We walked down the 3 flights of stairs in a heavy, suffocating silence. Michael stumbled twice. He looked like a man wandering through a waking nightmare. When we reached the damp concrete of the parking garage, I led him straight to my old battered truck. The moment the heavy metal doors slammed shut, enclosing us in the small dark cabin, Michael finally broke. The dam completely shattered. He buried his face in his hands and let out a sound that tore at my heart. It was not just a cry. It was a visceral, guttural sob of a man mourning the death of his own life. He wept for the illusion of love he had desperately clung to. He wept for the months of emotional torture he had endured believing he was the problem. He pounded his fists against the dashboard, his breath coming in ragged, jagged gasps. He called himself a fool. He called himself an idiot for letting Vanessa manipulate him, for letting her isolate him from me, for letting her treat him like a disposable pawn in her sick little game. The anger quickly replaced the sorrow. His tears dried up and a furious red flush spread across his face. He grabbed the door handle. He swore he was going up there right now. He wanted to kick the door down and scream in her face. He wanted to throw her out onto the street and call off the wedding in the most explosive way possible. He was vibrating with a blind, reckless rage. I reached out and clamped both my hands firmly onto his shoulders. I pulled him back into his seat with a physical strength that surprised him. I looked him dead in the eyes, and I spoke in a voice that was perfectly calm and cold as ice. I told him no. I told him he was not going back up there. I told him that screaming at Vanessa would only give her the upper hand. If he exploded now, she would twist the narrative. She would cry and play the victim. She would tell all her high society friends that he was unstable and abusive. She would use the very crazy label they planned to use on me and apply it to him. I told him that walking away in a fit of rage was the absolute worst thing he could do, because it meant they would walk away unpunished. I held his gaze and delivered the most important lesson I had ever taught him. I told him not to get mad. I told him to get smart. Anger is a cheap emotion. It burns fast and leaves you with nothing but ashes. But cold, calculated strategy is a weapon that can dismantle an enemy piece by piece. Michael stopped struggling. He looked at me, his breathing slowing down as my words penetrated his panic. He asked me what we were supposed to do. He asked how we could possibly fight back against people so deeply embedded in deception and fake wealth. I let go of his shoulders and leaned back in my worn driver's seat. I looked out through the rain-streaked windshield. I decided it was time to tell my son the truth about who I really was. I told him that Vanessa and Pamela looked at my faded flannel shirts and my calloused hands and saw a pathetic blue-collar handyman. I told him they thought I was a vulnerable old fool living on a meager pension. I turned to Michael and told him they were entirely wrong. I asked him if he remembered his childhood before his mother got sick. I asked if he remembered the big house we lived in before we moved to this quiet neighborhood. Michael nodded slowly, confusion creeping into his eyes. I took a deep breath and began to dismantle the facade I had maintained for over a decade. I told Michael that I was not just a retired carpenter who fixed leaky pipes for pocket change. I told him that 30 years ago I built a company from the ground up. I did not just work with wood. I worked with steel and concrete and millions of dollars in capital. I told him that I was the founder and sole owner of the largest commercial construction firm in the entire state. Michael stared at me in stunned silence. The revelation was too massive for him to comprehend instantly. I explained that my company had built the shopping centers, the corporate high-rises, and the luxury hotels downtown. I told him that the money I made was beyond anything Vanessa and Gerald could ever dream of pretending to have. I told him my wealth was not an illusion built on credit cards and leased cars. It was real, solid, and quietly compounding in secured trusts and private accounts for decades. I told him why I walked away. When his mother Diane was diagnosed with terminal cancer, I realized that no amount of money could buy more time. I stepped down as chief executive. I handed the daily operations to a board of directors, and I walked away from the corporate world to spend every remaining minute taking care of the woman I loved. When she passed away, I simply never went back. I found peace in my garage, working with my hands, living a quiet, anonymous life. I wanted Michael to grow up valuing hard work and character over bank accounts and social status, so I kept my wealth entirely hidden. Michael sat there, absorbing the magnitude of what I had just said. He looked at my hands, the same rough, scarred hands that Gerald had mocked just days prior. Now he understood that those hands had not just built furniture. Those hands had built an empire. I told him that Vanessa and Pamela had chosen the absolute wrong family to target. They thought they were outsmarting a naive young man and his penniless father. They had no idea they were declaring war on a man with infinite resources and a lifetime of experience crushing ruthless corporate predators. I leaned forward and outlined the plan. I told Michael that starting tomorrow we were going to play the roles they had assigned to us. We were going to give them exactly what they wanted to see. Michael would go back upstairs and pretend everything was perfectly fine. He would be the submissive, clueless groom. He would apologize for whatever trivial thing Vanessa was mad about. He would nod and smile and let her plan the massive engagement dinner she was demanding. I told him that I would play my part flawlessly. I would be the pathetic poor father who stays out of the way. I would act intimidated by their fake wealth. I would let them talk down to me. We would not give them a single reason to suspect that we knew anything about their criminal plot. We would let them become arrogant. We would let them become lazy and overconfident. While they were busy celebrating their fake victory, we would go to work in the shadows. I told Michael we were going to quietly dig into every corner of their lives. We were going to find out exactly how much debt Gerald was hiding. We were going to track down the fraudulent credit lines Vanessa was opening. We were going to lay a legal and financial trap so airtight that when it finally snapped shut, it would completely obliterate their entire existence. Michael looked at me and the fear in his eyes was completely gone. The tears had stopped. In their place was a cold, hardened resolve. The boy who had walked into this truck was dead. The man sitting beside me now was wide awake and ready for war. He wiped his face with the back of his sleeve and gave me a firm, steady nod. He told me he was ready. He opened the passenger door and stepped back out into the cold parking garage, turning to walk back up the stairs to face the woman who wanted to destroy him. I watched him go, knowing our silent shift had just sealed their fate. The morning sun barely cut through the heavy gray clouds as Michael pulled his car into my driveway. It was exactly 6 o'clock. He did not knock. He walked straight into the garage where I was already waiting for him. The smell of fresh sawdust and motor oil usually brought peace to this space, but today the air felt thick and electric. I had cleared my old oak workbench completely. The hand tools were put away. In their place sat 2 laptops, a stack of yellow legal pads, and a fresh pot of black coffee. Michael looked entirely exhausted, but his eyes were remarkably clear. The paralyzing confusion from the night before was completely gone. In its place was a cold and calculating focus. He pulled up a wooden stool and opened his laptop without saying a single word. We did not need to discuss our motivations anymore. We only needed to execute the plan. I sat across from him and opened my own computer. It was time to pull back the curtain on the glamorous illusion Vanessa and her family had constructed. During my 15 years running a commercial construction empire, I had learned that information is the most lethal weapon in any conflict. I still had a quiet network of contacts from my corporate days. I knew people who specialized in forensic accounting and deep background checks. These were men and women who could dig through digital concrete and find the buried skeletons. I made a single phone call to an old associate. I gave him the names Gerald and Pamela, along with their supposedly prestigious business addresses. I told him I needed a full financial autopsy immediately. My associate simply said it would be done. While we waited for the deep dive, Michael and I started our own search using public records and county court databases. We started with Gerald. This was the man who had sneered at my boots and demanded I park cars like a servant. This was the man who boasted about his vast portfolio as an investment banker. The truth we uncovered over the next 3 hours was nothing short of pathetic. Gerald was not an investment banker. He was not even a licensed broker. He was an unemployed scam artist operating a series of hollow shell companies. We pulled up the court records for his primary business entity. It was an absolute wasteland of active litigation. Gerald was currently facing 3 separate and massive fraud lawsuits. Former business partners and deceived investors were suing him for millions of dollars. His assets were frozen. His bank accounts were heavily garnished. We looked into the majestic colonial home they lived in. It was a short-term rental, and they were 4 months behind on the lease. The luxury imported cars they drove were heavily financed and currently listed for active repossession. Their country club memberships were revoked due to unpaid dues. Gerald and Pamela were completely broke. They were drowning in a suffocating ocean of debt, trying desperately to maintain the appearance of old money while their entire world crumbled around them. They were bleeding out, and Michael was supposed to be their emergency blood transfusion. Michael stared at this glowing screen. The reflection of the court documents danced across his pale face. He read the details of Gerald's bankruptcies over and over, as if trying to force his brain to accept the magnitude of the lie. He finally looked up at me. His voice was remarkably steady when he spoke. He said, "If her parents are complete frauds, we need to look at Vanessa." I nodded slowly. I told him that people who grow up learning how to construct elaborate lies usually apply those same skills to the people closest to them. I instructed Michael to log into the main credit bureau and pull a comprehensive report on his own social security number. He hesitated for a fraction of a second. The man who loved Vanessa was fighting his final battle against the man who now knew the awful truth. Then he typed in his details and clicked the button to generate the report. The loading circle spun on the screen. The silence in the garage was absolute. The page finally loaded. A long list of financial accounts populated the screen. Michael leaned forward, and his breathing suddenly stopped. He pointed a trembling finger at the monitor. There, at the very top of the list under his name, were two massive lines of credit. They were platinum accounts with exorbitant limits. Michael had never applied for them. He had never signed a single document for them. We clicked into the account details to see more. They had been opened less than 45 days ago. The mailing address was a private post office box across town. The email address associated with the accounts was a slight variation of Michael's actual email, designed to intercept all the banking alerts and monthly statements. Vanessa had stolen his identity. She had taken his social security number, forged his digital signature, and bypassed every security measure to grant herself unlimited access to his pristine credit history. This was no longer just emotional manipulation or greedy entitlement. This was a severe federal crime. She was actively stealing his future while sleeping next to him every single night. I watched my son process the ultimate betrayal. The woman he had planned to marry had viewed him as nothing more than a blank check. She had smiled at him, kissed him, and told him she loved him, all while secretly shackling him to a mountain of fraudulent debt. Michael did not cry. The sadness had been completely burned out of him. Instead, a quiet, terrifying calm settled over his features. He reached for his coffee mug, took a slow sip, and set it down. He looked at me with eyes that matched the cold steel of the tools hanging on my garage wall. He asked me how much she had stolen so far. We navigated to the current transaction history for the fraudulent platinum card. The list of recent charges painted a sickening picture of her extreme vanity. Thousands of dollars spent at designer boutiques, luxury salons, and high-end jewelers. She was funding her entire fake elite lifestyle with money stolen directly from the man she called her fiancé. But as we scrolled down to the pending transactions, one specific charge eclipsed all the others. It was glowing at the very top of the ledger processed just 2 hours ago. It was a single massive transaction for exactly $50,000. We looked at the merchant name attached to the charge. The text on the screen was unmistakably clear. It read, "The Grand Monarch Hotel." The sickening reality of her audacity washed over us. Vanessa had not just demanded a wildly expensive engagement dinner. When Michael had hesitated, citing his budget, she had simply taken the matter into her own hands. She had used his stolen identity and his ruined credit to pay the non-refundable deposit for the main ballroom at the most exclusive hotel in the city. She was using his own money stolen from his future to throw a party designed to impress the very people she was actively lying to. She was going to stand in that ballroom, wearing a dress bought on his stolen credit, drinking champagne, bought on his stolen credit, and she was going to banish me from the premises because my presence did not fit her aesthetic. Michael stared at the $50,000 charge. He slowly closed his laptop screen. He looked across the wooden workbench at me. He did not look like a victim anymore. He looked like a man ready to burn an empire to the ground. He asked me what our next move was. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my old leather contact book. I told my son that it was time to introduce Vanessa and her fake wealthy family to a very real and very ruthless kind of power. I told him we were going to let her have her precious dinner at the Grand Monarch. But first, I needed to make a phone call to my corporate attorney because the venue she had just booked was about to become the perfect trap. I left my garage with Michael right beside me. We climbed into my rusted pickup truck and drove away from our quiet suburban street. We headed straight for the towering glass and steel structures of the financial district. The morning traffic was heavy, but the silence inside the cabin was purposeful. Michael stared out the passenger window, watching the city skyline grow larger. He was processing the reality that the father he had known as a simple handyman actually helped build the very skyline we were driving toward. I parked my old truck in a subterranean VIP garage beneath a massive skyscraper. The security guard did not question my faded denim or my scuffed boots. He simply nodded and pressed the button to let us through. I guided my son to a private elevator that required a security keycard. I swiped a black plastic card I had kept hidden in my wallet for over a decade. The elevator hummed to life, taking us directly to the top floor. We stepped out into the reception area of the most feared and respected corporate law firm in the state. The lobby was lined with dark cherry wood and imported marble. A young receptionist looked up, ready to ask us to leave, her eyes scanning my flannel shirt with obvious disapproval. But before she could speak, an older woman stepped out from a corner office. Her face lit up with immediate recognition and absolute deference. She greeted me by name and personally escorted us down a long hallway toward the corner suite. Michael walked close to me, his eyes wide, as he absorbed the immense respect these people commanded and the way they yielded it all to his father. We reached a pair of heavy oak doors. I pushed them open and walked into the office of Mitchell. Mitchell was sitting behind a massive mahogany desk. He was a man in his late 60s wearing a custom-tailored charcoal suit. He had the eyes of a hawk and the smile of a seasoned predator. For 20 years, he had been my chief legal counsel. He was the man who crushed rival development firms, who navigated complex zoning laws, and who destroyed anyone foolish enough to try and cheat my company. When I stepped back from the corporate world to care for Diane, he remained the guardian of my trusts and holding companies. Mitchell stood up immediately and walked around his desk to shake my hand. He looked at my rough clothes and chuckled, telling me I still looked like I belonged on a scaffolding beam rather than a boardroom. I introduced him to Michael. Mitchell shook my son's hand firmly, sizing him up in an instant. I placed the printed credit reports and the financial documents we had uncovered directly onto his pristine desk. I did not waste time with small talk. I told Mitchell exactly what was happening. I explained Gerald's fake wealth, his hidden bankruptcies, and the mountain of active fraud lawsuits. Then I pointed to the bank statements showing the massive lines of credit Vanessa had illegally opened using Michael's social security number. I watched Mitchell's friendly demeanor vanish instantly. The warm smile was replaced by a cold, mechanical focus. He put on his reading glasses and picked up the papers. The room fell completely silent as he scanned the documents. His eyes moved rapidly over the fraudulent signatures and the private post office box addresses Vanessa had used to hide her crimes. When Mitchell finally looked up, his voice was devoid of any emotion. He told Michael that what his fiancée had done crossed far beyond simple greed. It was federal wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. Mitchell explained that Vanessa had systematically forged digital documents to deceive financial institutions. He said she was facing mandatory prison time if we handed this over to the authorities right now. Michael swallowed hard, but he did not ask for leniency. He simply asked what our next move should be. Mitchell walked back behind his desk and opened a secure portal on his computer. He told us he was going to contact the fraud departments of the issuing banks directly through his private channels. Mitchell explained his strategy with ruthless precision. He said, if we shut the credit cards down today, Vanessa would simply panic and try to cover her tracks. She might even try to blame the fraud on Michael, claiming he authorized the accounts. We could not allow her to control the narrative. Instead, Mitchell proposed a delayed execution. He would alert the fraud departments and initiate a covert lockdown on the accounts. The credit lines would remain seemingly active on her end, but the moment she tried to make her final payment for her extravagant party, the banks would flag the transaction, freeze the funds, and trigger an automatic fraud alert. We were going to give her just enough rope to hang herself publicly. Mitchell continued scrolling through the transaction history. He noted the thousands of dollars spent on designer dresses and luxury salons. Then his finger stopped near the top of the page. He adjusted his glasses and stared at the $50,000 non-refundable deposit. He read the name of the merchant out loud. The Grand Monarch Hotel. Mitchell lowered the paper and looked across the desk at me. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face. It was not a happy smile. It was the smile of a shark that had just smelled blood in the water. He leaned back in his leather chair and let out a rich, booming laugh that echoed off the mahogany walls. Michael looked between the two of us, completely confused by the sudden shift in tone. He asked Mitchell what was so funny about his stolen money being given to a luxury hotel. Mitchell stopped laughing, but the dangerous amusement remained in his eyes. He folded his hands on the desk and looked directly at my son. He asked Michael if I had ever told him the specific details of my investment portfolio. Michael shook his head, saying I had only ever mentioned building shopping centers and office parks. Mitchell pointed to the transaction record and dropped the piece of backstory that would seal Vanessa's fate forever. He told Michael that 30 years ago I had purchased a massive plot of undeveloped land right in the heart of the downtown financial district. He explained that I had personally overseen the architectural design, poured the concrete foundation, and supervised every single phase of construction for a flagship commercial property. That property was the Grand Monarch Hotel. Mitchell casually informed my son that while a global hospitality brand managed the daily operations, the building, the land, and the absolute authority over the premises belonged entirely to my primary holding company. I watched the realization hit my son like a physical blow. His mouth parted slightly as he processed the magnitude of what Mitchell was saying. I was not just a retired carpenter. I was the landlord of the most exclusive elite establishment in the entire city. Vanessa had scoured the entire downtown area looking for the perfect venue to show off her fake wealth. She had searched for a place so incredibly prestigious that a blue-collar handyman like me would not even be allowed through the front doors. Out of all the ballrooms and country clubs in the state, she had blindly chosen the one single building where her despised future father-in-law held supreme, unchallenged power. Mitchell leaned forward, tapping the piece of paper. He told Michael it was the most beautiful piece of poetic justice he had ever seen in his entire legal career. Vanessa had used stolen money to buy her way into my house. She was planning to banish me from my own property. Michael turned to me, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and absolute awe. He finally understood why I had not exploded in anger back at the apartment. He understood why I had told him to get smart instead of getting mad. The universe had just handed us the ultimate battlefield, and we owned the high ground. I looked at Mitchell and gave him his final instructions. I told him to let the fraudulent $50,000 deposit clear. I told him to let Vanessa believe she had secured the venue. I wanted her to invite every single one of her fake wealthy friends. I wanted Gerald and Pamela to strut through the marble foyer, acting like they owned the world. But I also told Mitchell to prepare a very specific set of legal documents for the night of the engagement dinner. I wanted copies of Gerald's bankruptcy filings and Vanessa's forged credit applications bound in legal folders. I wanted plainclothes fraud detectives standing by on speed dial. Mitchell wrote down every directive with swift, practiced strokes of his expensive pen. He assured me the trap would be completely airtight. When Vanessa tried to pay the final balance on the night of the event, her stolen credit cards would violently decline. The fraud alert would lock her out completely. And because I owned the building, she would have absolutely nowhere to run and nowhere to hide when the bill came due. Michael stood up from his chair. The exhaustion was gone, replaced by a fierce, burning anticipation. He shook Mitchell's hand with genuine gratitude. We walked out of the law office and stepped back into the private elevator. The doors slid shut, enclosing us in the quiet descent. I looked at my son and placed a hand on his shoulder. The trap was perfectly set. Vanessa had demanded a night she would never forget. We were going to make absolutely certain she got exactly what she asked for. The days that followed our meeting with Mitchell were a masterclass in patience. We had the high ground, but we needed to wait for the enemy to march fully into the valley before we closed the gates. Vanessa, completely unaware that a legal guillotine was hanging inches above her neck, became absolutely drunk on her perceived success. The $50,000 deposit at my hotel had cleared, and it acted like a shot of adrenaline to her already massive ego. She believed she had officially bought her way into the highest tier of the city elite. With the venue secured, her spending accelerated from reckless to entirely psychotic. I watched this unfold through Michael. He would come over to the garage in the evenings exhausted, but holding his composure, reporting every absurd purchase she made on those stolen credit lines. She hired a boutique floral designer from 2 states away, requiring imported orchids that cost more than a reliable used car. She booked a string quartet that usually only played for symphonies. She purchased a second gown just for the cocktail reception, claiming her $15,000 main dress was too heavy for dancing. Every single day, she found a new way to burn through the fraudulent funds. She was building a magnificent monument to her own vanity, completely blind to the fact that the foundation was made of quicksand. Her arrogance grew in direct proportion to her spending. She stopped asking Michael for his opinion and simply started issuing commands. She treated my son less like a future husband and more like an incompetent personal assistant. She would call him in the middle of his workday, demanding he leave his office to pick up fabric swatches or taste cake samples. If he hesitated even for a second to mention his job, she would unleash a torrent of verbal abuse, reminding him that her parents had important guests coming, and he was ruining her perfect vision. Michael played his part flawlessly. It broke my heart to watch him shrink his shoulders and apologize to her, but I knew he was doing exactly what we had planned. He absorbed her venom without a single complaint, playing the broken submissive fiancé to absolute perfection. He gave her exactly the power trip she craved, making her feel completely untouchable. The pinnacle of her delusion occurred exactly 4 days before the engagement dinner. I was in my driveway, organizing some lumber in the back of my old truck, when a sleek silver sports car pulled up to the curb. It was one of the luxury vehicles Gerald was currently hiding from repo men. Vanessa stepped out wearing oversized sunglasses and a sharp white coat that probably cost a month's rent. Michael was driving, and he climbed out behind her carrying 3 massive shopping bags from a high-end boutique. He looked like a pack mule trailing behind royalty. Vanessa did not bother to say hello when she walked up my driveway. She stopped 10 feet away from my truck and visibly pinched her nose as if the simple smell of cut pine and fresh air offended her delicate sensibilities. She looked me up and down, taking in my dusty boots and my worn flannel shirt with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. She crossed her arms and let out a long, dramatic sigh. She told me that they needed to have a very serious conversation about the upcoming dinner. I wiped my hands on a rag and nodded, acting like the obedient, clueless old man she believed me to be. She stated that the guest list had been finalized, and her parents had invited several very important corporate executives and city officials. She emphasized the word important, making sure I understood that I did not fit into that category. She then looked at Michael, demanding he explain the situation. My son lowered his head. He looked at the concrete driveway and shifted his weight, acting perfectly ashamed. He mumbled that the seating arrangements at the Grand Monarch were very strict. He said that Vanessa and her mother felt my presence at the main tables might cause some awkwardness for their distinguished guests. He apologized, playing the part of the completely defeated son, repeating the script she had forced him to memorize. Vanessa stepped forward, cutting him off. She said she was not going to sugarcoat things. She explicitly told me that I was not welcome inside the ballroom. She said my entire aesthetic was blue-collar and depressing. She told me that seeing a man with dirt permanently trapped under his fingernails eating from fine china would absolutely ruin the elegant atmosphere she had worked so hard to curate. She said her friends would ask questions, and she could not bear the humiliation of admitting her future father-in-law was a retired handyman who played with wood in a dirty garage. I stood there listening to this young woman casually erase my dignity. A younger me might have lost my temper. A less prepared man might have yelled or thrown her off the property, but I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, calculating calm. I knew that the ground she was standing on was crumbling. I simply looked at her and asked what she expected me to do while my only son celebrated his engagement. Vanessa smiled a thin, cruel smile that revealed the true depth of her malice. She said she had found the perfect compromise. Since the Grand Monarch was such an exclusive venue, they were expecting heavy traffic at the front entrance. She told me that instead of attending the dinner, she had arranged for me to work outside. She demanded that I put on a cheap black vest and stand in the valet line to park cars for her wealthy guests. She said it was the only way I could be useful without being seen. She actually framed it as a favor, telling me I could keep whatever small tips her parents' friends threw my way. The sheer disrespect was staggering. She wanted the man who literally owned the hotel to stand in the rain and park leased cars for her bankrupt parents. It was a level of cruelty that even I had not fully anticipated. Michael stood behind her, his hands gripping the shopping bag so tightly his knuckles were white. He looked at me, his eyes silently pleading with me to hold the line. We had promised not to break character. We had promised to let her dig the hole as deep as she possibly could. I lowered my head and stared at my dusty boots playing the part of a broken, humiliated old man. I told her in a quiet, defeated voice that I understood. I said I did not want to cause any embarrassment for her family on such an important night. I promised her I would stay completely out of sight and help with the cars at the front entrance. I told her whatever made her happy was fine by me. Vanessa beamed with arrogant satisfaction. She flipped her hair over her shoulder and praised Michael for finally getting me in line. She turned around without another word and walked back to the silver sports car, expecting Michael to follow like a dutiful servant. Michael lingered for just a fraction of a second. He looked up from the pavement, and our eyes met. Behind the mask of the beaten-down fiancé, I saw the fierce, burning anticipation of a man ready to drop a nuclear bomb on his oppressors. He gave me a barely perceptible nod before hurrying back to open her car door. I watched them drive away, the taillights disappearing down my quiet suburban street. The moment they were out of sight, I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and dialed a familiar number. Mitchell answered on the first ring. I did not bother with greetings. I told my attorney about the conversation that had just taken place. I told him she wanted me parking cars outside my own building. Mitchell let out a low, dark chuckle through the receiver. He said the sheer arrogance of these people belonged in a museum. He then delivered the news we had been waiting for. He told me he had just finalized the maneuver with the banking fraud departments. The trap was officially armed. Mitchell explained that he had successfully frozen the fraudulent credit lines Vanessa had opened in Michael's name. But he had done it using the covert lockdown strategy we discussed. To Vanessa, everything would look perfectly normal. Her banking apps would show an open balance. The hotel accounting department would see a valid card on file. But the accounts were completely paralyzed. No actual funds could be moved. The credit cards in her designer purse were now ticking time bombs waiting for the final detonation. The Grand Monarch policy was very strict. The final $100,000 balance for the catering, the string quartet, the premium alcohol, and the ballroom rental was to be processed exactly midway through the event. When the hotel management ran that card on the night of the engagement dinner, the system would violently decline the transaction. The banks would trigger a massive fraud alert, and the entire illusion would shatter in real time. I thanked Mitchell and hung up the phone. I stood in my driveway breathing in the cool evening air. Vanessa thought she had completely conquered us. She thought she was going to spend the night drinking expensive champagne while I stood in the cold parking cars for her fake wealthy parents. She had absolutely no idea that every single step she took toward that ballroom was a step closer to her own total destruction. The stage was set, and the final curtain was about to fall. The late afternoon light filtered through the dusty windows of my garage, casting long shadows across my old wooden workbench. I was standing perfectly still, listening to the low, steady hum of the air compressor. My faded flannel shirt and scuffed boots were covered in a fine layer of pine dust. To anyone looking through the window, I was just a tired old man finishing up another meaningless day of manual labor. But my mind was miles away from the wood and the tools. I was waiting for the signal. My cell phone vibrated violently against the heavy oak table. I wiped my hands on a shop rag, picked up the device, and saw Mitchell calling. I answered the phone, and my attorney's voice immediately filled the quiet space with a sharp electric energy. He did not bother with pleasantries. He told me that the final domino had just fallen exactly the way we had calculated. The accounting department at the Grand Monarch had just attempted to process the final massive payment for the engagement dinner. It was a charge of exactly $100,000, designed to cover the premium catering, the imported champagne, the string quartet, and the exclusive ballroom rental. Mitchell explained that the moment the hotel management ran the card through their merchant system, the bank reacted with absolute hostility. The transaction did not just decline due to insufficient funds. It triggered a catastrophic Level 1 fraud alert. The bank's security algorithms had instantly recognized the stolen identity and permanently locked the account. Vanessa had officially hit a solid brick wall. Her stolen financial lifeline was severed. She had absolutely no money, no credit, and no way to pay for the extravagant luxury party she had so violently demanded. Mitchell told me that the hotel general manager was in a state of absolute panic. The manager had called Mitchell's private office, sweating through his collar. The standard operating procedure for a declined payment of this massive magnitude was immediate and severely uncompromising. Protocol dictated that the events coordinator must instantly halt all preparations. The executive kitchen staff was supposed to stop cooking the 5-course gourmet meals. The imported floral arrangements were to be stripped from the tables and thrown into the service elevators. The grand double doors of the main ballroom were to be locked and chained shut by building security. When Vanessa and her fake wealthy family arrived at the lavish lobby later that evening, they were supposed to be met by a wall of security guards and quietly turned away in utter disgrace. The manager was begging Mitchell for legal permission to pull the plug, cut their financial losses, and shut the entire production down before the 200 high society guests started showing up. Mitchell paused over the phone. He asked me how I wanted to proceed. He told me that we could simply follow protocol and let the hotel cancel the event. We could let Vanessa show up in her $15,000 stolen designer dress, only to find the ballroom doors bolted shut. It would be a terribly humiliating end to her delusional fantasy. I stood there looking at the tools hanging on my garage wall. I thought about the way she had pinched her nose in disgust at my driveway. I thought about how she had demanded I stand out in the cold rain and park cars for her parents. I thought about the sheer, unadulterated cruelty of her plan to throw me into a miserable state, run nursing facility just to steal my home and fund her vanity. I told Mitchell that canceling the event was completely out of the question. I explained that shutting the party down before it started would be an act of mercy, and I was entirely out of mercy. Canceling the party would allow Vanessa and her parents to play the victim. They would spin a convenient lie to their wealthy elite friends. They would claim there was a banking error or a scheduling mix-up by incompetent hotel staff. They would find a way to slink away into the shadows, preserve their fake reputation, and avoid public accountability. I refused to let them hide behind another carefully constructed lie. I told Mitchell that I wanted them to experience the absolute peak of their arrogance in front of a live, captive audience. I instructed my attorney to draft a private executive directive immediately. As the supreme owner of the holding company that controlled the hotel property, I had the ultimate legal authority to override any standard operating procedure. I told Mitchell that I was personally underwriting the entire $100,000 cost of the evening. I was putting my own corporate capital on the line to guarantee that the doors to the ballroom remained wide open. Mitchell let out a low, deeply satisfied chuckle over the phone. He said he would draw up the override paperwork and courier it to the hotel manager right away. I did not stop there. I gave Mitchell very specific instructions to relay directly to the hotel management and staff. I wanted Vanessa and Gerald to be treated like absolute royalty when they walked through the front doors. I wanted the waiters to pour the most expensive vintage champagne without a single second of hesitation. I wanted the string quartet to play their favorite classical pieces as they entered the room. I wanted the executive chef to serve every single course of the gourmet meal with flawless precision. I commanded that not a single hotel employee was to mention the declined credit card, the fraud alert, or the unpaid balance. The staff was to behave as if everything was perfectly fine and fully funded. We were going to build them a beautiful golden pedestal and let them climb all the way to the very top. I wanted them to look out over a sea of 200 high society guests and feel completely invincible. I wanted them to feel like untouchable monarchs, because the higher they climbed, the more devastating the impact would be when I finally kicked that pedestal out from under them. Mitchell promised that the staff would execute the plan flawlessly. They were highly trained professionals, and they knew exactly who paid their salaries. I hung up the phone and sent a single text message to my son. The message simply said, "The green light is on." Michael replied instantly, with a simple period indicating he understood and was holding his position. I knew he was currently at his apartment getting dressed for the dinner. I knew he was playing his part perfectly, letting Vanessa bark vicious orders at him about his tie and his shoes. He was enduring the final hours of her suffocating abuse, knowing that his salvation was just around the corner. He had trusted me completely. He had followed my strategy without a single moment of doubt. Tonight, I was going to give my son his life back. I was going to surgically remove the toxic infection that had poisoned his future and isolated him from his family. I left the garage and walked into my quiet house. I took a long hot shower, washing away the sawdust and the grime of the blue-collar persona I had worn for months. I walked into my bedroom and opened the back of my closet. I pulled out a sharp, custom-tailored black suit. It was a suit woven from fine Italian wool, the kind of garment that commanded silence in a corporate boardroom. I put on a crisp white shirt and tied a silk tie. As I looked at my reflection in the mirror, the tired old handyman was completely gone. Staring back at me was the ruthless corporate founder who had built an empire from steel and concrete. Across town in their lavish rented mansions and luxury apartments, the antagonists were preparing for their grand triumph. Vanessa was slipping into a gown bought with stolen money, admiring her reflection. Gerald was practicing his arrogant smirk, polishing a fake luxury watch he could not afford. Pamela was fastening stolen diamonds around her neck, ready to sneer at anyone she deemed beneath her social class. They were drinking champagne and celebrating their brilliant manipulation. They truly believed they had won the ultimate game. They thought they had successfully erased a pathetic old man from existence and secured an endless stream of wealth from a naive young groom. They had absolutely no idea that their entire reality was a carefully constructed cage. The snare was fully armed, and the trapdoor was ready to drop. They were walking straight onto my personal battlefield, completely blind to the fact that they were trespassing on ground I owned. Tonight they would learn the hardest and most humiliating lesson of their miserable lives. The grand ballroom of the Grand Monarch was a breathtaking spectacle of extreme luxury and profound irony. 200 of the city's most elite residents filled the massive space, their voices echoing off the imported Italian marble and soaring vaulted ceilings. Thousands of delicate crystals dripped from the massive chandeliers, casting a warm golden glow over the immaculately decorated tables. A renowned string quartet played classical masterpieces in the corner, providing the perfect sophisticated soundtrack to the evening. The air was thick with the scent of rare imported orchids and the expensive perfumes of local politicians, corporate executives, and wealthy socialites. It was exactly the kind of fairy tale setting Vanessa had violently demanded. It was a towering monument to wealth and power constructed entirely on a foundation of stolen money, forged signatures, and federal wire fraud. Because of my private executive directive, the hotel staff executed everything with absolute flawless perfection. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos glided gracefully across the floor, carrying heavy silver trays loaded with gourmet caviar, hors d'oeuvres, and tall crystal flutes filled with the most expensive vintage champagne the hotel had in its underground cellars. The illusion of unlimited wealth was absolutely seamless. No one in that room had the slightest idea that the credit cards backing this magnificent event had been permanently frozen by banking fraud departments hours ago. Vanessa stood near the center of the room, completely intoxicated by her own perceived triumph. She wore the $15,000 designer gown she had purchased using Michael's compromised Social Security number. The heavy silk and lace dress swept across the polished floor, shimmering under the brilliant chandelier light. She looked like a queen holding court in her newly conquered kingdom. But her royal facade cracked the moment she interacted with anyone she deemed beneath her social class. The hotel manager, an old friend who knew exactly what was happening, quietly observed her behavior from the shadows and relayed the details to me. Vanessa snapped her fingers aggressively at passing waiters demanding fresh drinks before her glass was even empty. She openly criticized the temperature of the seared scallops, her voice carrying a sharp, shrill tone of entitlement that made the surrounding guests briefly pause their polite conversations. She complained about the ambient lighting, the specific folding arrangement of the linen napkins, and the tempo of the string quartet. She treated the highly trained hospitality professionals like incompetent peasants, completely blind to the fact that these same professionals knew exactly who was paying the massive catering bill. She strutted through the crowd with her head held high, bathing in the endless compliments and the envious stares of her fake wealthy friends. She was thoroughly convinced that she had outsmarted a pathetic old handyman, subdued a naive young groom, and secured a permanent place in elite luxury. Across the room, her parents were putting on an equally repulsive and delusional performance. Gerald stood by the massive mahogany bar, holding a top-shelf glass of bourbon, loudly dominating a conversation with two prominent city developers. He was wearing a custom-tailored suit that likely cost more than his entire remaining bank balance. He laughed boisterously, slapping the developers on the shoulder, boasting about his vast, entirely fictitious investment portfolio. He casually dropped fabricated numbers, talking about overseas real estate acquisitions and massive corporate mergers, acting as if he controlled the financial heartbeat of the entire city. He even had the sheer audacity to take full credit for the extravagant engagement dinner. He raised his glass to the crowd, loudly proclaiming that he and Pamela spared absolutely no expense for their beloved daughter, claiming they wanted to show the city how a true high society family celebrates a milestone. Pamela stood right beside him, draped in a heavy necklace of stolen diamonds, nodding with that familiar, sickeningly sweet smile. She gossiped with the wives of the local politicians, leaning in to whisper fabricated stories about their exclusive country club memberships and their upcoming vacations to private tropical islands. They were completely submerged in their own grand delusion. They were drowning in massive debt, facing severe corporate fraud lawsuits, and hiding from ruthless repossession agents. Yet they stood in the middle of a ballroom. They could never afford drinking top-shelf champagne. They did not pay for acting like the undisputed rulers of the universe. It was a spectacular display of peak arrogance. They were dancing gleefully on a trapdoor that was fully unlatched, celebrating a victory that did not actually exist. And then there was my son. Michael sat quietly at the center of the main head table, elevated slightly above the rest of the ballroom floor. He was dressed in a sharp, dark tuxedo, looking every bit the handsome, wealthy groom Vanessa demanded him to be. But his demeanor was completely detached from the chaotic, arrogant celebration happening around him. He did not mingle with the politicians. He did not drink the expensive vintage champagne. He did not laugh at Gerald's loud, obnoxious jokes about the working class. He sat perfectly still, observing the room with the cold, calculating eyes of a seasoned predator watching its prey wander deep into a dead-end canyon. Whenever Vanessa strutted past the elevated table to bark another petty command at him, he played his submissive role flawlessly. He nodded obediently, offered a polite, quiet apology for whatever minor detail she was furious about, and agreed to whatever demand she threw his way. He let her believe she was in total control of his mind and his wallet. He let her enjoy the absolute summit of her tyrannical power trip. But beneath the surface of the beaten-down fiancé, a fierce, highly controlled fire was burning. He watched Vanessa deliberately humiliate a young waiter, and his jaw tightened imperceptibly. He watched Gerald falsely boast about his immense wealth to the developers, and a tiny, almost invisible smirk crossed his lips. Michael knew exactly what was about to happen. He knew that the glamorous, untouchable world his fiancée and her parents were currently enjoying was about to evaporate into thin air, leaving them completely naked to the harsh reality of their crimes. He knew the hotel doors were sealed, and the legal snare was waiting to snap shut. Michael reached into his tuxedo jacket and pulled out his phone. He did not check for messages. He simply looked at the bright digital time on the screen. It was rapidly approaching the exact moment we had agreed upon. The moment the main dinner course would be cleared away, and the ceremonial speeches were scheduled to begin. He tapped his fingers rhythmically against the pristine white tablecloth, silently counting down the seconds. He looked past the crystal chandeliers and the dancing guests, his gaze fixed intensely on the grand double doors at the far end of the ballroom, the only entrance and exit to the magnificent space. The string quartet continued to play their beautiful, sweeping melodies. The elite guests continued to laugh and clink their crystal glasses in cheerful toasts. Vanessa continued to twirl in her stolen $15,000 dress, completely consumed by her own toxic vanity and bottomless greed. They were all entirely oblivious to the catastrophic storm that was gathering just outside those heavy mahogany doors. Michael checked his watch one final time, took a slow, deep breath, and waited in absolute silence for his father to arrive. The rain had stopped just before my black sedan pulled up to the front entrance of the Grand Monarch. The wet asphalt reflected the brilliant neon lights of the downtown financial district. I stepped out of the car and looked up at the towering glass and steel facade of the hotel. 30 years ago, I stood on this exact spot when it was nothing but dirt, open trenches, and exposed rebar. I had personally poured the foundation. I had inspected every steel beam that held this magnificent structure together. But tonight, I was not arriving as the architect, the builder, or the supreme landlord of the property. I was arriving simply as a father ready to protect his son. I adjusted the cuffs of my crisp white shirt. For the first time in over a decade, I was not wearing my faded flannel shirts or my scuffed work boots. I wore a sharp, custom-tailored midnight blue suit woven from the finest Italian wool. It fit perfectly, wrapping around my broad shoulders like a tailored suit of armor. My silver hair was neatly combed, and my posture was completely straight. I walked through the revolving glass doors and stepped into the magnificent lobby. The hotel staff had been thoroughly briefed by Mitchell. They recognized me instantly. The head concierge gave me a subtle, deeply respectful nod. The security guards, who normally questioned anyone looking out of place, quietly stepped aside and cleared a direct path for me. I walked toward the grand ballroom with the steady, measured pace of a man walking to an execution. The heavy mahogany doors loomed ahead of me. Muffled classical music and the loud, arrogant chatter of 200 wealthy guests bled through the thick wood. I took one final deep breath, pushed the massive doors open, and stepped over the threshold. The sheer visual assault of the room was staggering. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over seas of imported flowers and towering champagne towers. It was a masterpiece of extreme luxury, fully funded by federal wire fraud and my son's stolen future. I stood at the edge of the polished dance floor. Even in my impeccably tailored suit, I felt the immediate collective gaze of the room shift toward me. High society operates on a very specific exclusionary frequency. They can instantly sense when someone from outside their meticulously curated bubble enters their space. The polite conversations near the entrance began to falter. The clinking of crystal glasses slowed down. Wealthy eyes darted up and down my frame, silently calculating my net worth and finding me lacking. I stood perfectly still, letting the heavy, judgmental atmosphere settle over my shoulders. Across the vast expanse of the room, standing at the center of a large group of local politicians and elite socialites, was Vanessa. She was holding a crystal flute of vintage champagne radiating toxic vanity in her stolen $15,000 gown. She was in the middle of telling a loud, boastful story to her audience when her eyes locked onto me. I watched the fake, elegant smile freeze on her face. For a fraction of a second, absolute confusion flashed across her features. She saw a man in a sharp suit standing with absolute authority. But her deep, ingrained prejudice quickly overpowered her eyesight. Her arrogant mind simply refused to register me as a man of wealth or power. To her, I was just the pathetic old carpenter who was supposed to be outside in the freezing cold parking cars for her parents' guests. She could not comprehend how I had bypassed the strict hotel security and dared to contaminate her perfect evening. Her brief confusion instantly melted into pure, unadulterated malice. She saw an opportunity to perform to assert her absolute dominance in front of her elite audience. Vanessa took a slow sip of her champagne, turned slightly toward her circle of fake wealthy friends, and pointed her glass directly at me. The string quartet had hit a soft, quiet lull in their music, making her voice carry across the room with devastating clarity. She smirked, her lips curling into a cruel, ugly sneer, and whispered loudly enough for 3 surrounding tables to hear. "Oh, look," she mocked, her tone dripping with absolute poison. They even invited the handyman. The group of socialites surrounding her erupted into a chorus of condescending laughter. Pamela, standing nearby, covered in stolen diamonds, joined in the mockery, shaking her head and covering her mouth as if my presence was a tragic, comical mistake. The laughter spread like a virus through the nearby guests. Men in expensive tuxedos who inherited their wealth chuckled at the man who actually built the floor they were standing on. Women dripping in jewels scoffed at my presence. I stood there frozen. I did not drop my gaze. I did not flinch or turn red with embarrassment. I played the role of the humiliated, out-of-place old man perfectly. I let my shoulders drop just a fraction. I allowed a look of utter defeat to wash over my face. I had spent my life building structures that withstood hurricanes and earthquakes. I was not going to be broken by a 20-something fraud in a stolen dress. The laughter washed over me like a light rain on a tin roof. They thought they were breaking me. They believed they were cementing my place at the absolute bottom of their social hierarchy. They were completely blind to the fact that they were standing inside a cage that I had built, openly mocking the man holding the only key. I let them laugh. I let Vanessa revel in her perceived superiority. I waited in the deafening noise of their mockery, because I knew I did not have to say a single word. From the elevated head table at the far end of the room, a solitary figure stood up. Michael. He had been sitting quietly all evening, checking his watch, waiting for this exact moment. He did not rush. He did not look angry or panicked. He walked down the small carpeted steps of the platform and moved through the sea of laughing guests with a cold, terrifying grace. The defeated, submissive groom who had absorbed Vanessa's endless emotional abuse for months was entirely gone. The crowd naturally parted for him. As he walked past her circle of friends, Vanessa reached out to grab his arm, her cruel smirk still plastered on her face, likely intending to demand that he escort me back out to the parking lot. Michael did not even acknowledge her presence. He simply walked right past her outstretched hand, leaving her stunned and slightly off balance. Michael walked straight to the entrance where I was standing. The laughter around us began to die down rapidly, replaced by a confused, highly tense murmur. The guests watched in silence, expecting the groom to quietly dismiss his embarrassing father and save the elegant party. Michael stopped right in front of me. He looked at my tailored suit, his eyes shining with a fierce, profound pride. He did not apologize for his fiancée's behavior. He did not look ashamed of me. He reached out and firmly grabbed my hand, giving it a strong, reassuring squeeze that communicated months of silent suffering and ultimate relief. He leaned in close, his posture completely rigid, and his voice low but entirely unwavering. "Dad," he said quietly, ensuring only I could hear the absolute finality in his tone. "Trust me. Just tonight. It is time for us to get our revenge." Michael did not let go of my hand. He guided me through the parting sea of wealthy guests with a steady and unyielding pace. We walked directly past Vanessa, who was still standing with her mouth slightly open in shock. Her cruel laughter had died in her throat the moment Michael completely ignored her. The guests watched us move toward the elevated stage at the far end of the room. The string quartet slowly faded out their music, sensing the heavy shift in the atmosphere. Conversations died down to a hushed whisper. The clinking of silver on porcelain stopped completely. Everyone expected my son to gently escort his confused father out the side door before returning to make a charming toast to his beautiful bride. Michael let go of my hand when we reached the base of the stage. He walked up the 3 carpeted steps and stood behind the sleek acrylic podium. A solitary microphone rested on the stand. Behind him, 2 massive digital projection screens displayed a continuous loop of carefully curated romantic photographs. The images showed Michael and Vanessa smiling on sailboats, posing in front of expensive restaurants, and looking like the absolute picture of high society perfection. Vanessa quickly recovered from her shock and hurried back to her seat at the head table. She smoothed down the fabric of her stolen $15,000 gown and plastered a bright, expectant smile across her face. She raised her crystal flute of vintage champagne, ready to accept the glowing adoration of her fiancé in front of 200 elite witnesses. Gerald and Pamela sat right beside her, puffing out their chests and looking out over the crowd with supreme arrogance. Michael leaned towards the microphone. The feedback echoed sharply across the cavernous ballroom, demanding absolute attention. He looked out over the sea of faces. He did not smile. His posture was completely rigid. He spoke into the microphone, and his voice was devoid of any warmth or affection. He thanked the politicians, the corporate executives, and the socialites for taking time out of their busy schedules to attend the dinner. He said it was truly a historic night. Vanessa beamed with pride, leaning forward to soak in the attention. Pamela nodded approvingly at her future son-in-law. They were completely ready for him to sing their praises. But Michael did not look at Vanessa. He did not praise her beauty or her grace. He did not thank Gerald and Pamela for their generosity. Instead, he told the audience that an event of this incredible magnitude required a very special acknowledgement. He said that a party costing $100,000 did not just happen by magic. He explained that such an extravagant display of wealth required a benefactor with truly massive resources. The crowd murmured in quiet agreement, assuming he was about to flatter Gerald and his supposed investment banking empire. Gerald even adjusted his silk tie and puffed out his chest, ready to stand and take a bow. Michael gripped the edges of the podium. He said he was not the man who provided those resources, and Gerald was definitely not the man who provided those resources. Michael said there was only one person in the room who held the ultimate authority over the evening. He stepped away from the podium, pulled the microphone from its stand, and walked back down the 3 carpeted steps. He walked directly toward me. The entire ballroom watched in breathless confusion. Vanessa dropped her smile. Her perfectly manicured fingers tightened around the stem of her champagne flute. Gerald and Pamela exchanged a nervous, bewildered glance. Michael stopped right in front of me and placed the heavy metal microphone into my rough, calloused hand. He took a step back, crossing his arms over his chest, and gave me a firm nod. It was my turn. I gripped the microphone. I walked up the carpeted steps with the heavy, deliberate stride of a corporate founder stepping into a boardroom. I stood behind the podium and looked out over the vast sea of faces. 200 of the most powerful people in the city were staring at me. They saw a man they had just laughed at, a man they believed was a pathetic blue-collar handyman who did not belong in their presence. I let the silence stretch out for a long, agonizing moment. I wanted them to feel the sheer weight of my gaze. I raised the microphone to my mouth. My voice boomed through the state-of-the-art sound system, filling every corner of the massive room. I did not sound like a confused old man. I sounded like a man who commanded legions. I welcomed them all to the dinner, but more importantly, I welcomed them all to my hotel. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. People shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Vanessa shot up from her seat, her face turning a violent shade of pale white. She opened her mouth to shout something, to call me crazy, to demand security remove me from the stage. But before she could formulate a single word, I raised my free hand into the air. I looked directly up at the tinted glass of the audio-visual control booth located on the second-floor balcony. I snapped my fingers. The sound was sharp and resonant. The highly trained technical staff in the control booth executed my private directive instantly. The romantic slideshow playing on the two massive screens behind me abruptly cut to black. For 2 seconds, the ballroom was bathed in an eerie darkness. Then the high-definition projectors flared back to life, illuminating the entire room with a harsh, glaring white light. The romantic photographs of the happy couple were gone. In their place on the screen to my left was a heavily magnified, deeply detailed financial document. The words Chapter 7, Bankruptcy were printed in massive bold letters across the top. The document displayed a mountain of active fraud lawsuits, unpaid luxury car leases, and completely drained bank accounts. In the center of the screen, perfectly highlighted in a bright red box, was the name Gerald. The supposed investment banker, the man who had just spent the last 2 hours boasting about his vast overseas acquisitions, was publicly exposed as a completely broke, unemployed scam artist, drowning in massive debt. On the screen to my right, another set of documents appeared in crystal clear high definition. These were banking records and credit card applications. The audience could clearly see the exorbitant platinum credit limits. They could see the list of fraudulent charges for designer dresses, luxury salons, and expensive imported flowers. But the most devastating piece of evidence was highlighted at the very bottom. It was the digital signature used to illegally open the accounts. The signature clearly read, Vanessa. Right next to the forged signature was the final pending charge for $50,000 paid directly to the Grand Monarch Hotel. I spoke into the microphone while the documents burned brightly on the screens behind me. I explained to the 200 silent guests that the beautiful dress the bride was wearing was purchased with stolen money. I explained that the vintage champagne they were currently drinking was procured through federal wire fraud and severe identity theft. I told them that the parents of the bride were completely bankrupt frauds hiding from repossession agents while pretending to be high society royalty. The ballroom fell completely dead silent. The absolute lack of sound was terrifying. No one clapped. No one whispered. No one even dared to take a breath. The delicate illusion of extreme wealth and power was instantly and violently shattered into a million tiny pieces. The guests stared at the massive glowing screens, their eyes wide with absolute horror, as they read the undeniable legal proof of the criminal conspiracy. They slowly turned their heads to look at Vanessa Gerald and Pamela. The three antagonists sat frozen at the head table, completely bathed in the glaring white light of their own exposed lies. They were entirely trapped, with absolutely no way to deny the reality burning on the screens behind me. The heavy silence weighing down the grand ballroom lasted for what felt like an eternity. 200 elite guests stared at the towering high-definition screens, completely paralyzed by the massive financial documents displayed before them. The glaring white light illuminated every corner of the room, casting harsh shadows over the crystal centerpieces and the towering champagne pyramids. Vanessa stood frozen at the head table. Her knuckles were stark white as she gripped the stem of her crystal flute. Slowly, the absolute shock on her face morphed into a frantic, desperate denial. She was a woman who had spent her entire life constructing a flawless, wealthy persona, and she simply refused to let it collapse without a fight. She let out a loud, forced laugh that echoed terribly across the silent room. It was a shrill, unstable sound that lacked any genuine humor. She turned to the crowd of politicians and corporate executives, waving her free hand dismissively in the air. She projected her voice, attempting to sound entirely unbothered. She announced to her elite friends that this was clearly a bizarre, tasteless prank. She claimed Michael had a terrible sense of humor and must have hired a terrible comedian to ruin the romantic atmosphere of their engagement dinner. She insisted the documents were nothing but cheap, altered images designed to get a rise out of the audience. She plastered a wide, manic smile on her face and urged the guests to ignore the screens and continue drinking their expensive champagne. But absolutely no one in the room laughed with her. Not a single person raised their glass. The wealthy socialites and powerful developers sitting at the tables were not fools. They recognized legitimate legal filings and authentic bank statements when they saw them. They stared back at Vanessa with cold, unblinking judgment. The absolute lack of support caused the fake smile to slide right off her face. The champagne in her glass sloshed over the rim and spilled onto the pristine white tablecloth as her hands began to tremble violently. Panic finally breached her carefully constructed facade. She realized the audience was not buying her pathetic excuses. She abandoned her attempt to charm the crowd and spun around to face the second-floor audio-visual control booth. Her face flushed a deep, angry red. She pointed an accusing finger at the tinted glass windows where the technical staff was stationed. She screamed at the top of her lungs, demanding they cut the power to the projectors immediately. She ordered them to turn off the screens and restore the romantic slideshow. When the giant documents remained brightly illuminated, she lost whatever remaining composure she had left. She began threatening the technicians. She shrieked that she was the bride, that she had booked this venue, and that she would have every single employee in the building terminated and permanently blacklisted from the hospitality industry by tomorrow morning. Her frantic screams bounced off the marble walls, but the hotel staff did not move a single inch. The waiters stood perfectly still, holding their silver trays. The security guards remained stationed at the exits, with their hands folded behind their backs. Vanessa turned her wrath toward the hotel general manager, who was standing near the main buffet line. She ordered him to march up to the control booth and fire the technicians on the spot. She demanded he take control of his hotel and fix this humiliating disaster immediately. The general manager stepped forward slowly. He did not look intimidated or apologetic. He maintained an expression of absolute professional detachment. He spoke in a calm, measured tone that cut through her hysterical shouting. He informed Vanessa that the technicians were following direct orders. He stated with brutal clarity that while she may have attempted to rent the ballroom, she held absolutely no authority over the staff. He calmly explained that every single employee in the building answered exclusively to the supreme owner of the property. He then gestured politely toward me, standing quietly by the stage. The manager announced to the entire room that Mr. Gallagher was the sole proprietor of the Grand Monarch Hotel, and his directives superseded any standard operating procedure. The blood drained completely from Vanessa's face. She stumbled backward, knocking her chair over with a loud clatter. The reality of her situation finally breached the thick walls of her delusion. She looked at me standing in my custom-tailored midnight blue suit, and then she looked at Michael, who remained seated with an expression of cold, indifferent stone. She finally understood that she had marched her family straight into a flawless, inescapable trap. She was standing in my building, surrounded by my employees, completely at my mercy. Before she could formulate another lie, the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the ballroom swung open once again. The guests turned their heads as a new presence entered the room. It was Mitchell, my ruthless corporate attorney. He strode down the center aisle with the terrifying confidence of an apex predator. He carried a thick, black leather briefcase swinging gently at his side. But Mitchell was not alone. Flanking him on either side were two individuals wearing unassuming dark gray suits. As they walked under the brilliant light of the crystal chandeliers, the silver badges clipped to their belts became undeniably visible. They were plainclothes detectives from the Financial Fraud Division. The crowd of wealthy guests immediately parted, creating a wide, clear path toward the head table. The socialites pulled their chairs in tightly, eager to distance themselves from the unfolding criminal investigation. The mere sight of law enforcement completely destroyed whatever remaining arrogance Gerald and Pamela possessed. Gerald dropped his glass of top-shelf bourbon, letting it shatter against the polished marble floor. Pamela grabbed her husband's arm, her eyes darting nervously toward the emergency exits. But there was nowhere to run. Mitchell reached the elevated platform and stopped right in front of the antagonists. He opened his briefcase with a sharp snap that echoed in the quiet room. He pulled out thick stacks of printed legal documents that perfectly matched the devastating evidence glowing on the projection screens behind me. He did not need a microphone. His voice was naturally commanding, carrying the weight of absolute legal authority. Mitchell addressed the room, but his predatory gaze was locked entirely on Vanessa. He stated clearly and methodically that the event they were attending was funded by the proceeds of severe criminal activity. He explained the exact mechanics of the crime to the horrified audience. He detailed how Vanessa had maliciously stolen Michael's social security number to bypass banking security algorithms. He explained how she had forged digital signatures to open multiple platinum credit lines, hiding the statements in a private post office box across town. Mitchell then began to list the specific federal statutes she had violated. He spoke of aggravated identity theft. He spoke of wire fraud. He spoke of the deliberate deception of major financial institutions. He explained that these were not simple misunderstandings or clerical errors. These were calculated, deliberate federal felonies. He casually informed Vanessa that the mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines for these combined offenses would result in decades behind bars. He wanted her to fully understand the catastrophic legal avalanche that was currently crushing her life. He did not stop there. Mitchell turned his attention to the $50,000 deposit she had made to the Grand Monarch Hotel. He informed her that the credit card she had used was permanently frozen by the banking fraud departments hours ago. He explained that by attempting to process a massive payment using a stolen identity across state banking lines, she had elevated her crimes to a completely new level of severity. She had actively attempted to defraud a premier commercial institution. Vanessa stood trembling, her hands covering her mouth. The sheer magnitude of the penalties Mitchell was describing crushed the air from her lungs. She looked at the two detectives standing silently behind my attorney. Their presence a terrifying confirmation that this was not a threat, but an active legal execution. The reality check was absolute. There was no more room for lies. There was no more room for manipulation. The beautiful, glamorous world she thought she had conquered was gone forever, replaced by cold, hard facts and the devastating weight of the law. The sheer gravity of the impending prison sentences hung over the head table like a thick, suffocating cloud. The two fraud detectives took a single synchronized step forward, and that tiny movement was all it took to completely shatter the fragile loyalty of the antagonists. Self-preservation is a brutal primal instinct, and Gerald was a man who had spent his entire life sacrificing others to save himself. He looked at the detectives, then at the glowing screens displaying his bankruptcies, and finally at his daughter. The arrogant investment banker facade evaporated instantly, replaced by the frantic, terrified behavior of a cornered animal. Heavy beads of sweat formed on his forehead, shining under the bright light of the crystal chandeliers. Gerald literally backed away from Vanessa. He stumbled over the hem of her expensive stolen dress and bumped into the edge of the mahogany table, sending silverware crashing to the floor. He raised both his hands into the air in a gesture of absolute surrender and pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at his own child. His voice cracked as he shouted to the detectives and the silent crowd that he had absolutely nothing to do with the fraudulent credit cards. He screamed that the forged signatures were entirely her idea from the very beginning. He claimed he was just an innocent guest at this dinner, and that Vanessa had acted completely alone in stealing Michael's identity. He threw his own flesh and blood to the wolves without a single second of hesitation, begging the detectives to believe he had been manipulated by a greedy, deceitful daughter. He looked frantically at the prominent city developers he had been toasting with just moments before, pleading for them to intervene, but they simply turned their backs on him in disgust. Vanessa whipped her head around to stare at her father. The color that had drained from her face returned in a violent, flushed wave of pure, unadulterated fury. The betrayal from the man who had taught her every manipulative trick she knew struck her like a physical blow. The absolute hypocrisy of Gerald standing there in a tailored suit, paid for by her crimes, claiming innocence, broke whatever fragile mental dam she had left intact. Vanessa let out a raw, piercing shriek that forced several guests in the front row to physically flinch and cover their ears. She lunged forward, pointing right back at him, and her voice echoed with a shrill, terrifying desperation that completely filled the grand ballroom. She screamed that he was a pathetic, broke coward who could not even afford the gas in his leased luxury cars. The pristine $15,000 designer gown she wore suddenly looked like a cheap costume draped over a deeply unhinged woman. She turned to the audience of wealthy politicians and corporate executives and began tearing down her own parents with ruthless surgical precision. She told the horrified crowd that her father had literally begged her to secure the credit lines because his fake investment firm was completely bankrupt and facing imminent collapse. She shrieked about the 3 active fraud lawsuits naming the specific former partners sitting in the room who he had swindled out of millions. She shouted that Gerald had not closed a legitimate business deal in over 5 years, and that he spent his days dodging repossession agents who were actively hunting down his assets. She stripped him naked in front of the exact high society crowd he had spent all night trying to impress, leaving him completely exposed as a destitute, pathetic fraud who lived entirely off the stolen wealth of others. Pamela lunged forward, grabbing her daughter's arm in a frantic, desperate attempt to silence her. Her face was twisted into a bizarre, agonizing grimace as she tried to maintain a fake, polite smile for the audience, while violently digging her manicured fingernails into Vanessa's skin. She hissed through her teeth, begging Vanessa to stop talking and salvage whatever tiny shred of dignity they had left before the city elite. But Vanessa was entirely too far gone. The toxic cocktail of public humiliation and impending arrest had turned her into a rabid dog biting anyone within reach. She violently yanked her arm away from her mother and turned her venomous rage entirely onto Pamela. She yelled that her mother was just as guilty and just as broke as Gerald. Vanessa announced to the entire silent ballroom that the heavy diamond necklace draped around Pamela's neck was completely fake. She shouted that Pamela had pawned the real heirloom diamonds months ago just to keep their country club membership active for 1 more week before they were permanently banned for unpaid dues. She exposed how her mother had orchestrated the entire plan to manipulate Michael, plotting to lock a healthy older man in a miserable state-run nursing facility just to steal his home and liquidate his assets. Pamela staggered backward as the fake diamonds clattered against her chest, finally collapsing into her chair as the crushing weight of public exposure destroyed her entire social standing forever. The elite guests watched in absolute revulsion as the family tore each other to pieces. Women covered their mouths in shock, and powerful men shook their heads in utter disgust. The beautiful, glittering illusion of high society royalty had devolved into a pathetic, vulgar screaming match. They were no longer the kings and queens of the ballroom. They were feral, desperate creatures fighting over scraps in a sinking ship, completely destroying one another in front of the entire city elite. Through the entire chaotic spectacle, Michael and I remained perfectly still. We did not raise our voices to interrupt their mutual destruction. We did not insult them or gloat over their magnificent downfall. We simply stood shoulder to shoulder, watching the toxic infection purge itself from our lives. Michael looked at the woman he had almost married, observing her frantic screaming, her ruined mascara, and her vicious attacks on her own parents. I could see the final heavy chains of his emotional captivity dissolving into dust. He finally saw her not as the beautiful, demanding partner he needed to please, but as the deeply broken, malicious fraud she truly was. The contrast between our absolute stone-cold silence and their hysterical implosion was incredibly striking. We did not need to lift a single finger to destroy them, because true greed always consumes itself in the end. The renowned string quartet had packed up their instruments long ago, leaving the cavernous room completely devoid of any sophisticated ambiance. The only sounds left were the harsh echoes of their desperate accusations. The detectives stood patiently watching the family confess to multiple severe financial crimes in real time, their presence capturing every single shrieking admission of guilt. The guests who had arrived expecting an elegant, sophisticated engagement dinner were now slowly backing away toward the heavy mahogany doors, eager to escape the radioactive fallout of the ruined family. The glittering chandeliers continued to shine brightly overhead, casting a harsh, unforgiving light on the 3 broken figures at the head table. They had wanted the grandest, most unforgettable night of their lives. They had desperately craved the attention of the absolute highest echelon of society. And now they finally had it. The entire room was watching them self-destruct, and neither Michael nor I offered them a single ounce of mercy. The two detectives did not waste another second. They moved with the clinical precision of men who had seen this exact brand of vanity go up in flames 100 times before. They stepped past the discarded silverware and the spilled wine, stopping directly in front of Gerald. The sharp metallic sound of handcuffs clicking shut echoed through the vast ballroom like the closing of a tomb door. Gerald let out a pathetic whimpering sound, his knees buckling as he was forced to turn around. He was no longer the arrogant king of the financial district. He was just a small, broken man in a suit he could not pay for. The detectives read him his rights, his voice muffled by the shame that now radiated from him like heat from a furnace. Before they could reach Vanessa, she tried to scramble away, but her heels caught on the heavy silk hem of her $15,000 gown. She went down hard. She hit the polished marble floor with a sickening thud, her expensive hair spilling across the cold stone like a dark, tangled mess. The second detective knelt beside her, his movements efficient and utterly devoid of pity. He pulled her arms behind her back, and the second set of handcuffs snapped into place. Vanessa did not fight anymore. The adrenaline that had fueled her screams just moments ago had completely evaporated, leaving her an empty, shivering shell of a woman. She stayed on the floor, right where she had fallen, surrounded by the physical debris of her ruined evening. The general manager of the Grand Monarch walked toward the head table with a heavy clipboard held firmly against his chest. He stood over Vanessa, looking down at her with a face that revealed absolutely nothing. He did not ask how she was. He did not offer a hand to help her stand. He simply reached into his pocket, pulled out a stiff cream-colored document, and placed it on the floor right next to her trembling hands. It was the itemized bill for the entire evening. $150,000. The catering charges, the premium bar fees, the orchestra costs, the ballroom rental, and the extra security details were all laid out in perfect black ink. He told her clearly and loudly that the payment was due immediately. He explained that since the credit card on file was flagged for massive fraud, the hotel required an alternative payment method right now, or they would have to involve the precinct sergeant to process the debt as theft of services. Vanessa stared at the bill, her eyes unfocused and swimming in tears. She was surrounded by the remnants of the life she had desperately tried to fake. The bill for the engagement dinner sat there, a final mocking tally of her spectacular failure. She looked around the room, hoping to find an ally, a friend, or even a distant acquaintance who might offer her a sympathetic glance. But the ballroom was no longer filled with adoring elite guests. The room was empty. 200 people had walked out of those double doors, leaving the ballroom a ghost town of discarded napkins and half-empty crystal glasses. The socialites, the developers, the politicians, they had all fled as soon as they realized the magnitude of the scandal. They did not want to be anywhere near the stench of such a public disgrace. They had vanished like shadows in the morning light, leaving behind only the cold reality of the unpaid bill. I walked over to the head table and looked down at my daughter-in-law. She was huddled on the floor in her ruined dress. Her makeup was smudged and gray streaks of mascara ran down her pale cheeks. She looked like a ghost of the person who had strutted through these halls just an hour ago, demanding respect from everyone she passed. I felt no surge of triumph. I felt no burning desire to kick her while she was down. I only felt a deep, hollow sadness for the complete lack of humanity that had driven her to this specific floor. Michael stood beside me, his expression carved out of granite. He did not look at her with anger. He looked at her with a profound and terrifying indifference. The woman who had spent months calling him useless and spineless was now a weeping prisoner on the floor of a hotel she thought she owned. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and pleading. She whispered that she could fix this. She begged me to call Mitchell and tell him it was all a terrible mistake. She claimed she had other money hidden away, that she could pay the bill by tomorrow morning. Her voice was thin and brittle, cracking under the weight of the ruin she had invited into her own house. I simply looked at her and said nothing. There was nothing left to say. The time for negotiations, for fake apologies, and for manipulation had passed. She had chosen to build her life on a foundation of shifting sand, and now she was watching the tide come in. The detectives signaled to the hotel staff. 2 officers walked over to Vanessa and helped her to her feet. She was unsteady, her knees shaking as they guided her toward the main exit. She cast one last desperate look at the ballroom floor, at the shattered remains of her fairy tale dinner. She passed by the tables where her parents were being processed by the police, their faces obscured by their own hands, in a pathetic attempt to hide from the reality of their capture. It was a parade of ignominy. The police escorted them out through the main lobby, past the front desk staff, and out into the waiting squad cars. The sirens began to wail, a sharp, lonely sound that ripped through the quiet night air of the financial district. I turned back to the room. The ballroom was still beautiful, but it felt different now. It was finally clean. The toxicity, the greed, the arrogance, it had all been hauled out the front door in handcuffs. I looked at Michael. He was breathing deeply, as if he were taking his first breath of clean air in an entire lifetime. He walked over to the podium where I had exposed them. He picked up the microphone and turned it off with a satisfying click. He handed the microphone to the manager and then looked at me with a nod that said more than 1,000 words. We had walked onto a battlefield where we were supposed to be the victims, but we had emerged as the architects of our own salvation. The ballroom was empty and silent, save for the sounds of the cleaning crew beginning to sweep away the remnants of the evening. It was a fresh start. We walked toward the exit together, stepping out of the hotel and into the cool, crisp air of the city night. The street was empty except for the fading red lights of the departing police cruisers. My son reached out and gripped my shoulder, his touch firm and grounded. I looked up at the stars, and for the first time in my life, I knew that the path ahead was completely our own. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers danced rhythmically against the towering glass facade of the Grand Monarch Hotel. Each pulse of color illuminated the shocked faces of the remaining hotel staff and the few bystanders who had lingered near the curb. I watched from the shadows of the hotel awning as the officers shoved Gerald and Pamela into the back of the first cruiser. They looked small and defeated, their expensive suits disheveled and their arrogance completely extinguished. A second cruiser pulled up to take Vanessa. She was still weeping, her face buried in her hands as the officers forced her to duck her head so she would not hit the roof of the vehicle. I did not move toward them. I did not shout insults. I did not take photos to capture their misery for the internet. I simply stood there, watching the car doors slam shut, with a finality that felt like the closing of a heavy iron gate. My son Michael stood beside me, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his tuxedo trousers. He watched the red lights fade into the distance as the cruisers turned the corner and disappeared from view. He did not look like the man who had been terrorized by a gold-digging fiancée or the man who had been manipulated by his own sense of duty. He stood with his shoulders back, his gaze clear and his breathing slow and steady. He was looking at the empty street where just an hour ago he had been trapped in a web of deceit. He finally turned his head to look at me, and there was a profound sense of relief in his expression. We did not need to speak about what had happened. The silence between us was no longer heavy or filled with anxiety. It was comfortable, it was clean, and it was honest. I gestured toward the private hotel exit, a side door that led to a secluded alleyway. We did not want to deal with the inevitable swarm of press or curious onlookers still milling about the front entrance. We walked through the back service corridors where the lingering smell of industrial cleaners reminded me of the life I had built with my own hands. We emerged into the quiet night air of the alley, where my old battered truck was waiting patiently under a flickering street lamp. The sight of that truck was a relief. It was honest and reliable and entirely unpretentious. I tossed my suit jacket into the back seat and rolled up my shirt sleeves, feeling the cool night air against my skin. Michael climbed into the passenger side, and as the engine rumbled to life, a long dormant part of my soul finally felt at peace. We drove through the city streets away from the financial district and the luxury hotels. We bypassed the neighborhoods of the elite and the mansions of the fake wealthy. We drove toward the edge of town where the neon signs of late-night diners flickered in the darkness. I pulled into a small, quiet diner that had been there since before Michael was born. The sign hummed with a tired buzz, and the parking lot was almost empty, save for a few delivery trucks. We walked inside and chose a booth in the very back corner, away from the prying eyes of other customers. The vinyl seats were cracked, and the smell of grease and grilled meat hung in the air, a sharp contrast to the stale perfume and expensive flowers of the ballroom. A waitress with a tired but kind face walked over and dropped 2 laminated menus on the table. We did not look at them. I ordered 2 black coffees and 2 double cheeseburgers with extra pickles. I did not need a fancy menu to tell me what I wanted. I just wanted something simple and real. When the waitress brought the food, the steam rising from the burgers felt like the most luxurious thing I had ever experienced. We ate in a comfortable silence. The only sounds in the diner were the soft murmur of the radio in the background and the occasional clink of silverware on ceramic plates. I looked at Michael. He was eating his burger with an appetite he had not shown in months. He was finally free to be himself. He was no longer worried about Vanessa's demands or her parents' expectations. He was no longer tethered to a life that had been designed to slowly hollow him out. I told him that I was proud of him for having the courage to trust me and the resilience to walk through the fire. He looked up at me and his voice was soft but steady. He told me that he finally understood what I had been trying to teach him about building a life. He admitted that he had been so busy trying to satisfy a superficial vision of success that he had completely forgotten who he was and what actually mattered. He said he was going to quit his corporate firm on Monday morning. He wanted to come back to the garage with me. He wanted to learn how to restore the vintage cars that had been my passion for years. He wanted to build something real with his own hands rather than chasing the empty promises of people like Vanessa. I felt a surge of emotion that made it hard to speak. I reached across the table and placed my hand on his. I told him that the garage was his whenever he was ready. We would work together side by side. We would build, we would fix, we would create things that lasted. There was no room for greed or manipulation in that workspace. There was only hard, honest work and the satisfaction of a job well done. We sat there until the waitress brought the check. The total was small, a tiny fraction of the hundreds of thousands of dollars Vanessa had tried to steal from us. I placed a generous tip on the table and stood up. As we walked out, the cool night air greeted us, and for the first time in my 70 years, I felt entirely unburdened. The toxic infection had been surgically removed from our lives. The greed, the arrogance, and the betrayal were gone. There was no more pretense. There were no more hidden agendas. There was only the quiet dignity of a father and son moving forward into a future they had reclaimed together. We got into the truck and started the engine. The drive home was quiet and calm. I knew there would be legal battles ahead regarding the fraud and the lawsuits, but they did not scare me anymore. I had the truth on my side, and I had the person who mattered most sitting right next to me. I pulled into my driveway and turned off the engine. The house stood silent and dark, but it felt warm and welcoming. It was a home built on decades of loyalty and genuine love, and that was a fortress no one could ever breach again. Michael stayed in the truck for a moment looking at the house. He said that he had never felt so relieved in his entire life. I agreed. I told him that the price we paid was high, but the reward of our freedom was immeasurable. We walked toward the front door together. I opened it, and the familiar smell of wood and wax greeted us. We had survived the ultimate test, and in the process we had discovered that true family is not defined by external success or material wealth. It is forged in steel through the fire of trials and the strength of character. I looked at my son one last time before we went inside, knowing we would wake up tomorrow in a world that was entirely and wonderfully our own. Everything that mattered had been saved. Everything that was rotten had been swept away, and we were finally home. The most profound lesson from this journey is that true worth is never found in the validation of those who view you as a resource. For years, I allowed myself to be measured by the standards of others, shrinking my own value to fit into their hollow expectations. I learned that setting firm boundaries is not an act of cruelty, but a vital act of self-preservation. When you stop financing the illusions of those who betray you, you finally gain the clarity to see who is truly standing by your side. Wealth is not just about what is in your bank account. It is about the peace you maintain when you refuse to trade your dignity for someone else's fleeting approval. If this story reminded you to reclaim your own worth, subscribe to the channel for more powerful life lessons.